Hello and welcome to the Secular Nation Podcast. I am your host, Tim Brannan, with my co-host, Michael X.
Hello.
Well, Mike, it's the holiday season once again.
You don't say.
I'm actually surprised. It's been like only a month since our last episode. I think it's like the first time we actually did an episode with less than 2 months in between.
So our monthly podcast is actually monthly.
Yeah, that just puts more pressure on us.
I know, and it takes me a week to edit these things, so it's like,
these things just take so much energy out of me. I need 2 months to recover. So,
well, yeah, you're like one of the starting pitchers for A-League baseball team. You've got to rest up.
Yeah. So again, holiday season. Whether you celebrate Christmas or solstice or Festivus or any of those secular alternative holidays we kind of just made up.
Chalaka, Human Light, what, Krampusmas? What's the way?
I don't know. But actually, speaking of the podcast, I was actually earlier this week, I actually got a question of mine read on the Yo, Is This Racist podcast. So my question was about nativity pageants.
Are they racist?
Yeah, well, just the idea of... I got the idea a while ago. I was flipping through this catalog. They were selling, like, stuff for nativity pageants and costumes, and I just see this picture of, like, all these white-ass kids, dressed up, like people from the Middle East. And I'm just kind of like, there's something sort of wrong about that. I don't know.
So it's almost like the moral equivalent of a kid at Thanksgiving wearing a Native American costume.
Yeah, it's technically brownface, if you want to put it that way. But that actually kind of reminds me of the movie coming out right now, Exodus, Gods and Kings, which I haven't seen yet, though. The people who do reviews that I trust, so I don't actually have to see movies, didn't much care for it. But that was one of the big issues, is that, we're talking about, people in Egypt, and they're all played by the whitest bunch of people ever.
Right.
Like, apparently, Jesse Pinkman's in it.
What do you say? Yo, Moses, bitch.
Yeah.
So having a movie set in the Middle East with an all-star Caucasian cast.
Yeah. And apparently the movie's boring as hell.
Ooh, well, I guess I could say something about white people and boring, but...
Yeah.
Well, I should bring up something that happened with my daughter last weekend.
Okay.
That she had a sleepover. She's 13, and
nice.
And the friend is Christian, and my daughter refers to herself as an atheist, and the friend is cool with my daughter's atheism, but I guess the mother, apparently she took the opportunity during the sleepover to proselytize to all the girls present, including my daughter, and including a girl who's Muslim. Just not cool. Very not cool.
Seriously.
Yeah, if I wanted to play the stereotypical atheist, I would rush over to this house and say, how dare you do this to my daughter, and tell her about how science is a lie and you need to get right with God. But I didn't, because I know my daughter is going to say, you know what she's saying is bullshit. And she didn't turn into a born-again Christian, so I guess no harm, no foul.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing about atheism parenting is, trusting your children to make those decisions for themselves, But again, I would love to have seen the reaction if she had a sleepover at your house, and then you went in there saying, it's like, now we're going to teach all...
Well, maybe I should have her on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Just bring on, now I'm going to read some Hitchens for you.
Right. We're going to sit around and read responsibly from the Gospel of Hitchens.
So earlier, we had the pleasure of interviewing GretaChristina about her new book, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God.
Yeah, and I tried to pitch the idea of turning this podcast into something like the Serial podcast, where we would interview her for 12 hours and then serialize it in 12 episodes, but for some reason she wasn't down with that.
All right, so without further ado... Hello, I'm Tim Brannan, and with me, Michael X, as always. And tonight we're very proud to have GretaChristina with us, atheist blogger, author of Why Are Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless, Coming Out Atheists, How to Do It, How to Help Each Other, and Why. And her latest book that's coming out very soon, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. Greta, great having you on the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So let's dive right into this. This is your new book, and it's about death, which is obviously something everyone has to contend with, whether you believe in a god or not. So what led you to want to start this book?
Well, when I was leaving my own religious and spiritual beliefs, dealing with death and mortality was one of the most difficult things about it. You know, contending with the fact and accepting the fact that when I die, it's really going to be permanent, that when people I love die, it's really permanent and I'm really never going to see them again. That was the most upsetting and painful things about letting go of my beliefs. And at the time, I didn't really have much connection with an atheist community, a humanist community, a secular skeptical community. And I wasn't very familiar with, some of the writing that had been done about this topic. And so I kind of had to go it alone. I kind of had to reinvent the wheel and come up with my own ways of coping with the reality of mortality. And I don't want other people to have to do that. I don't want other people to have to do that alone. I do think that we all deal with death in different ways, obviously, but I would like for other people who are either they're in process of letting go of their religious beliefs and they're struggling with how do I deal with the fact that death really is permanent, or they've already let go of their religious beliefs, but for some reason or another, they're confronting mortality, they're confronting grief, whether that's grief over the death of somebody that they love, whether it's confronting their own mortality for some reason. I don't want other people to have to go through that alone. And so, I put together this, short collection of writings that I've done about death, to give some people some ideas of some possible ways to come to terms with death and accept it with some degree of peace when you accept that it really is permanent.
It seems to be one of those issues that's really hit a tipping point in the atheist movement. A lot of people have been talking about death. There's a Grief Beyond Belief organization that's been starting up. And personally, I've had some experiences with 2 different hospice nurses in the last year who have told me that there's been no training for a lot of grief counselors on how to deal with people who are dying or have families dying who don't believe.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge problem. It's something that Rebecca Henschler, who's the founder of Grief Beyond Belief, for people who aren't familiar with them, they're the online atheist support group for people who are grieving. And she says, yeah, there's little or no grief support that's specifically aimed at non-believers. It's apart from her group, and there's very little training for hospice workers, for grief counselors, and so on, for how to deal with people who are grieving who don't have a belief in an afterlife. And quite the contrary, generally speaking, they say, support your people in finding their own spiritual ways and so on, which is fine as far as it goes, but a lot of people obviously don't have spiritual beliefs about an afterlife. And also, for a lot of people, death and grief can be what starts them questioning their religious beliefs. There's a number of atheists who will say that some of what, got them questioning religion was that, there's somebody they love died. It was a horrible death. It was an unfair death. It was a death that was too young. It was an accident or a very young illness or something like that. And they started questioning, why would God do this? And I think that people like grief counselors and hospice workers need to be prepared to deal with not just people who are already non-believers and who are grieving, but people whose grief is causing them to question their religious beliefs. And that can be legitimate. It's not appropriate to just say, oh, well, here's all the ways that you can hang on to your faith. It's appropriate for counselors to say, if you are legitimately on a path out of your religion, they need to be able to support people in that.
And I got to read a substantial portion of the copy of the book I was given. I found a lot of your insights very fascinating and kind of mirroring a lot of the thoughts I've had on it. I think somewhere in there you just say that, it just sucks. Which actually, there was a time I used to attend Zen Buddhist lectures. And that was the Roshi's main thing. Whenever he talked about death, all he really had to say was, it sucks.
Well, and I do think that it is one of the things that I think is an important way of dealing with death, is to accept we don't have to sugarcoat it. We don't have to pretend that it isn't terrible. And I think that that is something that a lot of religious believers do wrestle with, is they feel like, well, I shouldn't be torn up about this. I should be believing that I'm going to see Mom again in a couple decades, that this is just a temporary goodbye. I shouldn't be terrified when I'm confronting my own death. And yet, but why am I? There's a lot of religious believers who do report feeling guilt about feeling bad about death. And that's a terrible thing. I think that we can accept death with some degree of peace, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be all sunshine and roses. And I feel like that's an important thing to say about this book is when I say that the ideas I write in this book offer some degree of comfort in the face of death, it's not that means that it eradicates death. It's not like, morphine where it completely makes the pain go away. It's just kind of, I feel like, our, humanist and materialist philosophies about death, they can soften it, they can make it a little more tolerable. They can give us a sense that, okay, when the horrible grief passes, or when whatever fear we're having about our own mortality passes, we'll have a life to come back to, and we'll have a foundation to come back to that's solid. And that's what I think is meant by comfort. But I think it's okay for us to say, this is hard. It's hard to deal with the death of people we love. It's hard to look at our own death. And, life is valuable and it's precious, and we should mourn its loss. And I do think that actually, kind of paradoxically, that's one of the things that atheism has to offer, is we don't have to pretend that we don't feel grief. We don't have to feel bad about the fact that we do grieve. We don't have to be torn up about, why am I grieving when I theoretically believe that this is just a temporary separation?
It's funny, rather than having a spoonful of BS to help the medicine go down. There was a great quote that you have in the book. One of the opening points is that the finality of death kind of helps us focus our lives. And this is a quote directly from the book. The same way that LGBT people are forced to think about sexuality and gender, the same way that vegetarians are forced to think about the ethics of food, atheists are forced to think about death and what kind of value life might have when it's brief and finite, which really, I think, sums up why atheists are in a great position to understand death.
Well, and it is one of the things that sometimes frustrates me. I think that atheists often concede the ground of death. We just sort of tend to say, oh, well, religion's got that covered. It really would be, religion has us beat on the death issue. And I don't actually think that's true. I do think that atheist and humanist views of death do have a great deal to offer people. And one of the main things they have to offer people is that they're true. They're based in reality. And I know from my own experience, and also talking with other former believers, that when I was a believer, my beliefs about an afterlife, they were only comforting when I didn't think about them very carefully. And that meant that if I was gripped with grief or gripped with fear for my own mortality, I couldn't really ponder. I couldn't really meditate on my philosophies and my beliefs. And I kind of had to just think, oh yeah, it's fine because I'm going to live again someday, and then I'd have to shove it to the back burner. Whereas with my humanist and materialist views of death, they do feel like a solid foundation. And getting back to the question you were asking, I do think that there is this sort of odd advantage in being a minority or being marginalized. Obviously it's mostly not an advantage to be marginalized, obviously. But there is this sort of strange advantage, which is that you're forced to think about things that people in the mainstream just kind of take for granted and don't really consider. An example of that is, for instance, in LGBT relationships, I've seen some studies showing that LGBT relationships tend to be more egalitarian in terms of housework and, who does what and who contributes what, compared to opposite sex relationships. Because in opposite-sex relationships, you don't have to think about that question. It's very easy to just fall into the default, which is that women do most of the housework and women do most of the childcare. And it's very easy to fall into that default, even if you think you're trying to question it and push back on it. Whereas if you're in a situation like you're in a same-sex relationship, you have to think about that question from the ground up. And I think similarly for atheists, we can't just fall into the default way of dealing with death, which is it isn't real, which is sort of the religious denialism of death, that it's not real and it's really just a temporary way station on the way to permanent bliss and happiness. That means we have to really examine the question of death and mortality, and that means that that I think our views are in some ways a little bit more robust. They're more closely examined, and again, they're based in reality. They're not based in denial, which I do think is a big advantage.
Yeah, I like how in your book you do sort of go through the different theories of an afterlife, and you do kind of question would we really want them? I mean, immortality, one of those things. I mean, I think perhaps most of us would agree that we would like to live longer lives, but I think there probably was a point where what, I don't want to live 7 quadrillion years.
Well, it is one of the things that, that I talk about in the book is that, again, atheists tend to sort of concede the ground of death to religion. So, religious ways of viewing death, it would be better if that were true. It would be better if heaven that was true. But when you start really examining heaven, I think is a perfect example, although there's other examples as well. The idea of heaven, it's kind of incoherent. I mean, basically what it says is you will be you. You will be who you are, and you're going to be living in bliss with everybody you've ever loved, with your family, with your friends, and they are all going to be exactly who they are. They're going to be their truest selves, but you're not going to have any conflict. You're not ever going to make any mistakes. You're not going to do anything bad. Well, then how are we who we are?
Boring.
It's boring, for one thing. We who we are people who need change and challenge. And, there's all that research showing that we think that we're going to be happy sitting on the beach with our feet up and a drink in our hand, but we're not. We're happiest most of the time when we're working. And when we're working on something that we care about and that challenges us. So if we don't have challenge and if we don't have conflict, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm just too cantankerous a person. I can't imagine. The people I love are very cantankerous people. I literally don't understand what it would mean for me to be who I am and for the people I love to be who they are and to not have conflict.
Well, Greta, maybe when you're up in heaven, you can write a book, Why Are Angels So Angry? But I'm reminded of Julia Sweeney's joke where, somebody said, well, wouldn't it be great to see your family up in heaven? It's like, nah, not really.
Yeah, and then what about the family that didn't make it into heaven?
Well, and that's a big issue. That's a very serious issue, actually, for a lot of Christians. Is they say, oh yes, it's like believing in heaven. That's so comforting in the face of death. But if you also believe in hell, that can be very upsetting. And a lot of Christians say this. They're very tormented by this problem of, well, okay, I'm going to heaven, of course, which is arrogant, but let's not go there. Of course I'm going to heaven, but I know that I have people in my life who aren't. There's people I care about. I have children who have left the faith. I have grandchildren who have left the faith. And they're going to be tortured in hell. How can heaven possibly be heaven if the people I love are in hell, and in hell with no possibility of redemption? They're being tortured forever. And when you look at the Christian theological responses to this, they're terrible. Either they say, well, you're going to be happy about it because, look, the righteousness of the evil being tortured. And, that's the whole Calvinist thing, is that one of the great things about being heaven is watching people being tortured in hell.
Holy Schadenfreude.
Yeah, exactly. Or they'll say something like, you just won't know about it. You're going to be so overcome by the bliss of being in Jesus' presence that you're not even going to know that the people you love are being tortured. And I'm like, what? I don't even know what to respond to that. That's just evil. That is flat out evil. This idea that that an appropriate response to what's going to happen to the people I love who are suffering is, well, you won't care. I mean, again, how does that make me who I am? And it's funny, it's very contradictory, because Christians always say, well, the thing that makes humans special is that we're free to choose. that we're free to choose evil, but then apparently in heaven that's eradicated. We're not free to choose evil. And also the thing that makes us who we are is that we love the people we love. That's the best part about us, is our compassion. So what you're saying is, if you're a really good person, you're a compassionate person in this life, and you really love people and you really try your best to make things better for people, your reward in heaven is to not care anymore.
But yeah, that is such a standard trope of apologetics that it's always asked, if God wants us to believe in him, why doesn't he just show himself or just make us believe in him? But it's no, he doesn't, because we have free will. But then what's the point of this? The whole purpose is to go to heaven, and he takes it away. I mean,
exactly.
I mean, you could send Hitler to heaven and just take away his free will and turn him into a zombie like everyone else. I mean,
it's almost like everybody's up on, been dosed on opium or something. Like heaven is the opiate of the masses.
I say that is death in a way. I mean, if someone just wipes your personality, that is hardly different from killing that person.
Yeah, exactly. It's who are you? What, it's there's no self there. And so that's what I mean when I say religious beliefs about death and, immortality, they're consoling as long as you don't think about them. But once you start thinking about them for 30 seconds, it's it's riddled with inconsistencies, and it's riddled with this kind of immorality. And that's not just Christianity. It's I was actually never a Christian. I believed in all this New Age stuff, and most, and as relevant to death, I believed in reincarnation. And then I always had to kind of ask this question: well, okay, so this idea of reincarnation is that you are who you are, and you get reincarnated as different people or animals or whatever, but you don't remember. You don't have any memories of who you were before. So how is that me? How is it that I am me? What it's how is it meaningful to say, well, I, in some former life I was, Queen Victoria or whatever. But how is that me if I don't remember it? A substantial part of who we are is our memories. It's a central part of who we are. And so again, it was this thing where I would be comforted by that belief, but then I'd have to stop thinking about it because I knew it didn't really make sense.
Well, that's why you have to cleanse your mind of your negative body thetans with the E-meter that L. Ron Hubbard talked about. That was the whole premise of Scientology, is if you do this, then you will remember past lives. So you can only do that if you're a Scientologist. Right.
Yeah. And that's super based in reality. So
exactly.
They got that covered, right?
You cite a study in your book in which religious people not only are more likely to use last-ditch medical care in the last week of their lives, but also less likely to plan in advance of death, have a living will, and things like that. It's almost like the belief in an afterlife encourages you to keep your head in the sand and maintain magical thinking.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I have come to the conclusion, at least a provisional conclusion, that religious ways of coping with death, they're not really ways of coping with death. They're ways of avoiding it. They're ways of ignoring it and kind of putting it on the back burner. And that research you're talking about is a prime example of that religious people who are very religious are less likely to have prepared for death, to have advanced directives about what to do when they're sick and so on, than secular people or less religious people. And they're more likely to have these extreme interventions in the last week of their lives. And that tells me that religion isn't really helping them cope with death. They're just kind of ignoring it. And when they have to actually confront it, either by, for instance, sitting down and saying, okay, here's what's going to happen when I get sick, when I'm dying, I want to have a will, and here's what I want to happen to my body, and if I get this sick, pull the plug, and so on. They're less willing to have those conversations and to think about those issues. And when death is really staring them in the face, they're desperately trying to put it off. Whereas it seems as if secular people are more willing to accept the reality of death, both in advance, and say, okay, death is coming, and so I need to be ready for it, and when it's really staring them in the face. And so again, that tells me that that religious ways of coping with death are not actually that comforting. And I really do encourage atheists to talk about death more. It's like I do think that, again, we tend to concede this ground. And of course, it's not light party banter. It's not like, hey, so how are you doing? Well, I've been thinking about mortality. Let's talk about mortality over cocktails. But I do think that the more we talk about how we view death and how we view mortality and how we deal with grief, that will make it easier for people who are questioning their religious beliefs but are afraid to let go.
Yeah, I mean, on that whole, there was a news story released recently about a Canadian family that they had a dead body in their attic for 6 months because they were praying for it to come back to life.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extreme example, obviously. Most religious believers aren't that extreme. But yeah, and I can imagine, somebody who's just has really serious, mental health problems that for whatever reason. But yeah, it's like religion does give you this, it tries to deal with death by ignoring it. And that's obviously not healthy. And whether that's not healthy in the more common way of you're not preparing a living will, or in the extremely unhealthy way of restoring the body in the attic.
So, well, maybe this is a good point in the conversation to bring up the issues of death and how they intersect with issues of social justice. You've been writing about that in your blog.
Yeah, I have been doing a little bit of writing about that, and it was, so obviously I'm coming out with this book about ways of coping with death, ways of coping with mortality and grief and so on. And I realized I hadn't really written anything in the book about how do you cope with death that's really unjust, and not unjust in the sense of, my mother's death, you could say, was very unjust. She died at age 45 of cancer. That's really unfair. Yeah. But it's natural. It's not, it's unfair in the sense that it's always unfair when somebody dies at age 45. But when you look at the death of somebody like Eric Garner, you look at the death of somebody like Michael Brown, you look at the death of somebody who's killed by human beings for absolutely no good reason, and their deaths are brought about by this incredibly racist policing system, and that's supported by a racist society, and it's supported by a society that's racist in the sense of thinking less of black people and thinking that black people are less human, that they're demon, that they're demonic, that they're criminal, that they're more likely to be violent and so on, or that's racist in the sense of just wanting to ignore this issue and wanting to not be inconvenienced by the protests and so on about it. And I realized I hadn't really said anything about that in the book. And I realized there's not, if somebody is saying, it's like, oh my gosh, if somebody's saying, my mother died of cancer and I'm feeling really sad about it, what do you have to say? And there's assorted, humanist philosophies, that I can talk about. I can say things like, well, she's not in pain. It's like being dead isn't any different from not having been born yet. And, that's not a terrible thing. I can say things like, death is a natural part of life. It's necessary in order for life and change to happen. And, it's part of being a biological animal. It's part of the deal. I can say things like, we were astronomically lucky to have been born even in the first place. And so, it's we shouldn't complain about being mortal. But, and if your mom has died of cancer at age 70, that's one thing. If your son has been shot, at age 30, 20, 15, for no reason, I'm not going to say any of those things. It would be just unbelievably callous. And so mostly what I want to say is, this is terrible. How can I help? It's and I don't want to say, I don't, and sometimes, and this is actually to some extent true across the board, whether people are grieving somebody who's died of natural causes or who has died of some horribly unjust human cause. And people often don't want to hear platitudes. That comes later. They can search that out on their own. But often they don't want to hear philosophy. A lot of what people say they want to hear is, I'm so sorry, this sucks, how can I help? And that's a lot of what I want to say when I'm looking at these terribly unjust deaths and this just epidemic of police shootings of anybody, but disproportionately of Black people in the United States. What I want to say is, I am so sorry. This sucks. What can I do to help?
Yeah, I think that really goes back with what we were saying earlier about how since we don't believe in God, we kind of have to stop and think about these things. In the same way, I think, we don't have a sense of divine justice. These cops who went away without being indicted, without being formally charged. We can't rest on the laurels that they'll see their ultimate end when they go to hell or whatever. That I think it is important that, we who don't believe in stuff like that, we are concerned with issues of social justice.
Yeah, it's and for me, I know there's people who think that, social justice is just this completely somehow unrelated to atheism. For me, it's very much tied in with it because technically, in the most narrow sense of the word, atheism just means not believing in God. And then if you want to expand it a little bit, it means not believing in the supernatural or an afterlife. But that conclusion has implications.
Yeah.
And one of those implications is this life is all there is. This is all we've got. And so, we talked earlier a little bit about sort of this concept of death as a deadline. And that certainly works for me to drive just my own life. It's like, I want to make as much as I can out of my life. I want to do the work that I want to do with this life. I don't want to just sit around and be lazy and put my feet up. I want to work. I want to do things that matter. I want to really, engage and savor my life and do the things that I enjoy. But it also means that I want to make other people's lives better. Because if somebody has a finite life and they're born into just poverty and misery and despair, and it's like, they get to live 15 years and then they get to die of starvation or being shot. That's just profoundly not okay. And I can't say, oh, well, it's all right because they're going to go to heaven. It's funny. When I was a kid, I used to love the story of the little match girl. Do you know the story of the little match girl?
Yeah.
It's like the poor little girl. It was a Hans Christian Andersen film. I promise this isn't a tangent. This seems like a tangent, but I promise it's not. There's the story of the poor little match girl. She's this poor, poverty-stricken girl selling matches on the street, and it's Christmas, and it's snowing, and she's freezing, and she's freezing, so she starts lighting her matches to keep warm. And every time she lights a match, she'll see this vision. She sees a vision of a beautiful dinner, and then the match burns out and it's gone, and then she lights another match, and she sees a beautiful vision of a warm fireplace, and so on. And then she strikes her last match and she sees this beautiful vision of her grandmother who is dead. And the match goes out, but her grandmother doesn't go away like the other visions. Her grandmother carries her off to heaven. And I used to love this story when I was a kid. And I told my mother that I love this story, and she said, I hate that story. And I said, why do you hate that story? And she said, I hate that story because it says that it's okay for little children to die and freeze to death in the streets because they're going to go to heaven. And that really stuck with me, and that's how I feel. I don't, as an atheist and as a humanist, I can't say, well, it's okay that, that children starve to death. It's okay that, people get beaten to death, that women get beaten to death in Islamist theocracies. It's okay that, Black people get shot by cops every 3 days in the United States because they're going to go to heaven. I can't say that, so it's my responsibility to do something about it now.
It's funny because you make a good case for it being for a philosophical parallel between issues of social justice and death. There's also a skeptical way of looking at it too, in terms of the thought process. If you're facing death and you're using heaven as kind of an escape hatch to avoid thinking about the difficult issues, and the same thing with the idea that, say, the grand jury in Ferguson made a just decision because they saw all the evidence, is a way of escaping having to think about, well, how are grand juries selected and how are they run, and why didn't they use a special prosecutor in the Ferguson case, and that maybe that was part of the systemic racism. So it's a way of kind of avoiding the difficult thinking as well.
Yeah, no, that's I hadn't thought about that parallel, but I think that that's true. And, it is kind of interesting the way that sort of a lot of traditional skeptics they want skepticism applied to the things that skepticism has always been applied to, to chupacabra, to astrology. And, we can expand it to things like vaccines or global climate change or whatever. If you want to get really radical and really political, we can talk about vaccines and global climate change. But they don't want to talk about things like skepticism, applying skeptical evidence-based practices to policing practices, what policing practices actually work and what outcomes do they produce, to things like, the justice system and grand juries. Why is it that grand juries indict in over 99% of the time, but when it comes to police being prosecuted, grand juries indict. There's very bad statistics about this, unsurprisingly, but it's something like less than 5% of the time. Why skeptics should be really skeptical of that. They don't want to apply skepticism to things like the drug war, and why is the drug war being waged, and does it have any effect effect to reduce the harm that's done by certain dangerous drugs and so on. So yeah, I don't know. I thought I was going somewhere with that, but I think where I'm going with that is a very, very long rant. So, but yeah,
we got time.
I think just basically to tie it up that, skepticism can be applied to almost any question of what is or is not true in the world, and that includes questions like, police policies, law, and so on. And again, atheism, I mean, if you want to, the thing that always strikes me about the, atheism only means atheism. It doesn't have, and if it's, you shouldn't be having mission drift by having it apply to all these other things. Well, if you go that route, atheists can't work on anything. Atheists can't work on church-state separation because that's it's like you could theoretically believe in God and still think that religion is good for people and is good for government.
Pledge of Allegiance is a first world problem.
Right. Basically, if you want to say we can't work on anything other than the non-existence of God, literally all atheist activists could do is go around trying to persuade people that God doesn't exist, and even not then, because not believing in God doesn't necessarily imply that other people should believe in God. There are atheists who think religion is good for people and some people need it. So, unless what you want for your atheist community is to sit around the library table talking about 20 more reasons why God doesn't exist, you're going to have to start delving into, well, what are some of the implications of this conclusion? What does atheism mean? How does it change our life? And getting back to the topic of the book, atheists look at a lot of things differently from religious believers, and, we look at, the whole question of ultimate justice, very differently from religious believers, and we look at the question of death very differently from religious believers. And I think that that's a big part of what atheist community building and atheist movement building is about is, atheism has conclusions. It has that conclusion that God doesn't exist has implications. So let's talk about some of those implications and let's work on them.
You've written a lot before about your secular meditation practice. There's been a lot of discussion lately, some kind of secular Buddhist concepts have crept into the atheist movement, such as the idea of non-self. And has this thinking about death come out of your meditation practice?
Well, it didn't come out of the meditation practice. I've only been meditating for about a year and a half, and I've been looking at this question of death, secular death, and writing about it for many years. It was actually the first piece of non-religious writing I ever did, was, explicitly non-religious writing I ever did, was writing about death. The essay that is the core essay of this collection, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. But certainly, meditation has shaped the way I look at death, and the way I look at death has shaped my meditation. And in particular, one of the things about, my secular meditation practice, I think everybody does it a little differently, but one of the things about my practice is that a lot of what it has to do with is accepting the feelings that I have, accepting my experience as it is, and not constantly, this is sort of American thing where we're constantly trying to make ourselves feel better. And if we feel even just a little bit bad, we see it as this crisis and we have to fix immediately. It's heaven forbid, Loki forbid, we should be bored for 15 seconds, gotta look at the phone, and heaven forbid we should feel sad about anything. We have to cheer up. And a lot of what the meditation and mindfulness practice that I'm doing has to do with just sitting with my experiences and just having them. And that's some of what I talk about in the book, back to the thing we were talking about before, is that about sort of this idea that we can accept death, but we can also accept that death sucks, and we can accept that it's frightening. We can accept that, of course it's frightening. We descended, as secularists, we know, we descended from hundreds of millions of years of ancestors who really didn't want to die, not wanting to die is a powerful evolutionary strategy. And so, of course, we're afraid of death. And, of course, we grieve when the people we love die. We're social animals. We bond. And, of course, that when that bond is broken forever, of course, we're going to feel bad about it. And so I think the degree to which meditation and mindfulness has informed the way I look at this is to just really, to accept that, and to just really, if I'm grieving, to let myself just feel that grief rather than trying to suppress it or distract myself from it or shove it to the back burner.
Well, it is the holiday season right now. I was actually sort of thinking of maybe making a yearly thing where we sort of ask our guests, how they celebrate the season. Do they do Christmas or one of the alternatives that we have?
Human light.
Festivus, solstice.
Well, so I'm a very celebratory person, and so I tend to just look at the whole month of December as a big celebratory mishmash. Mm-hmm. And I kind of don't care what it is. I'm fine with secular Christmas. I'm fine with secularizing Christmas. I mean, I grew up my parents were non-believers. I grew up in a secular household, and we had the tree and pretended Santa and all that stuff. And I'm fine with that. I also understand that other atheists don't like it, and I respect their reasons for not doing it. There's other atheists for whom the religious part of it is too much in their face. They don't feel like they can secularize it, and I think that's fine. But yeah, personally, I'm like, whatever. I will go to a Christmas party. I will go to a solstice party. I will go to a Hanukkah party. I will go to a Festivus party. I will go to a Brightmas, whatever. I like parties. and I like celebrating. And so, yeah, I will pretty much do it all. And I don't really think of it as Christmas exactly. It's just sort of the winter holidays, and it's just all one big mushy thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's people, there's alcohol, there's kissing, there's presents. I mean, what else?
There's food, and there's lights, and there's dressing up, and it's singing, and all those good things, and I kind of tend to think of the what's the true meaning of Christmas? Obviously, the true meaning, and for me, the true meaning of Christmas is it's cold, it's dark, the weather is lousy, we're going to be stuck inside with each other for a while. So we should celebrate. We should form social bonds, because, boy, we're going to be inside with each other for a while. So let's remind each other of why we like each other. and let's give each other presents, and let's eat good food, and let's do sort of have traditional things that we do at the same time every year that kind of give us a sense of continuity. And I don't think any of that has to do with religion. I think it's just, human beings seem to have a need for celebration and a need for tradition, and I don't see any reason to not do that, especially if it involves singing and dancing and dressing up and alcohol and food.
It's almost like the pagans got it right in that sense, that it's a little microcosm of the humanist response to death. It's a humanistic response to cold and dark and being stuck inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just bring a tree inside and get drunk. All right. Well, Greta, it was amazing having you on the show. Perhaps in the future we could have you on again.
I'd be delighted to.
Awesome. All right. And for all our listeners, whatever you choose to observe, if you choose to observe anything at all, happy holidays.
And if you don't choose to observe any holidays, enjoy your December.
Yeah.